Good evening, everyone. And again, Shana Tova. I hope that everyone has had a wonderful, wonderful holiday season. I know that all of you individuals who were having family and friends over, it's now wonderful to be able to relax a little bit. So, this evening, I'm going to be talking to you about Mizrahi Jewish history and its communities. And what I'm going to do is there's a lot of history here. In fact, history that goes back to the time of the first temple. And it is a history that is very rich. It has very deep roots in the East, in the Middle East. But it is also more recently a very sad history. And for those of you who came to the lectures that I did last year, the first one was about the Jewish communities of the Czech Republic and Poland. And the sad thing there is that there are very few Jews who remain because of the Holocaust. What we're going to find is that Jewish communities that were profoundly rooted in various countries of the Middle East under the various empires of antiquity, that up until the 20th century, they were vibrant. And with the beginning of the 20th century, with the march of Zionism, these communities found it more and more difficult to exist in the Islamic world. And so we're going to be looking at all of this, trying to put it together to have a sense of how they got there, what they did, and where they are going, if anywhere. So I'm just going to quickly do a little something here. Yeah. All right. So this map is something that's very familiar to us. It is a map of the current geography and topography of the Middle East. We see the modern state of Israel. We see the countries that surround us. And what's interesting is this particular map is something that was very, very popular. It was done at the end of the Renaissance. And we can tell that it's at the end of the Renaissance because we can see down in that left-hand corner, you've got America. But this is the rest of the world. And the center of the world was not Rome. It was not another great city. It was Jerusalem. That was the center of the world. This is the ancient land of Canaan. And what we see there are how the tribes settled into that land. And we can see the various names for the tribes, those who were to the east of the Jordan River, those who were to the west. And we have no idea what King David and King Solomon looked like. These are late medieval representations of the two kings. And I show that because in time, Israel became a kingdom. And what we see at the very, very bottom is Solomon's kingdom. And if we go up to the top in what is a large portion of modern day Syria, what we see, that was the extent of David's kingdom. This was a golden age, both in Jewish history and in the history of the land and what Jews were able to accomplish. But the kingdom divided. very, very sadly, in roughly the year 930 BCE, there was a rebellion by an individual by the name of Jeroboam. And he rebelled against the authority of Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And because of this civil war, the kingdoms are going to split. There will be a divided kingdom. And from this point on, the land of Israel is truly in danger because the land is surrounded by great kingdoms and empires, and they are going to vie for this area. In the year 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire is going to literally obliterate the northern kingdom. That is the kingdom of Israel. And between 732 and 722, the majority of the population of the kingdom of Israel is going to be deported, and they will be deported into areas of the Assyrian Empire. And they are going to be the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because even once the Jews come back to the land, they have absolutely disappeared. This is a 19th century painting. It is called The Death of Sardanapalus, and it's by Eugene Delacroix. And it shows the evening that his capital city, Nineveh, fell to the Babylonians. And what he ordained is that all of his wives and concubines would be killed, and that all of his slaves would be killed. And many of those slaves would have been Jews from the northern kingdom. With the fall of Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire, Babylonia, the Babylonian Empire, is predominant. And one of the things that is going to happen, the cuneiform tablet on the right tells us about some of this, that the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is looking towards the riches of Judah and Jerusalem. And we know that they are going to attack the southern kingdom, the only kingdom now. And in 598 BCE, the Babylonians take Jerusalem, but they do not destroy it. What they do is they take hostage the king, many members of the upper classes, of the royal family, individuals who were of the social and religious and political elites, and they take them to Babylon. But they give the city of Jerusalem and the rump of Judea, they give them the possibility of a degree of autonomy. Now, you may all remember that just after Rosh Hashanah, there is a minor fast. It's the Tzom Gedalia. It is the fast of Gedalia. And he was put in control. And unfortunately, because he was seen as a puppet of Babylon, he was assassinated. And this brings back the Babylonians. And in 586 BCE, they destroyed Jerusalem and the first temple. Many of the remaining Jews, if you were in the lower social echelons, you would have been left in Judea without a government, without any priests to help you through things. But all of the rest of the upper classes were deported to Babylon. And here we see a 19th century painting, and we know what's happening. This is by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. This is Psalm 137. And that is what happened. Everyone remembered what had happened, what had gone before. Babylon also falls. In 516 BCE, Babylon falls to the rising Persian Empire. And eventually, the Persian King of Kings, Cyrus I, would permit Ezra, who was a scribe and a learned man, to return with some of the other captives from Babylon and to rebuild Zion and to bring back law and order and religious stability. And that would lead to ancient Judea. On the left-hand side, if you've ever been to Israel, you know that there is a model of what Jerusalem looked like in the first century BCE and of the Common Era. And in the map on the right, we see Judea, Samaria just above it, and then at the very top, we see Galilee. This is what the nation of Judea, this is what the Jewish people looked like in the first century AD. And as the little caption at the top tells us, this is Israel at the time of Jesus. And this is another view of that. And this is the rebuilt temple. This is not the temple that Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt. This is the rebuilding that Herod the Great does in order to curry favor with his Jewish subjects. Unfortunately, because of the pressures from the expanding Roman Empire and their desire to put up statues to pagan gods, to demand extra payments from the temple, there is a rebellion in Jerusalem and throughout that land. And in 70, they erupt, and a Roman army eventually comes in, led by Vespasian, whom we see on the left-hand side of the screen, and he eventually is besieging Jerusalem. And his son Titus is going to have to finish the battle for him because Vespasian is called back to Rome to become the new emperor. And this is the Arch of Titus in Rome. And what it shows us is the menorah from the temple is being paraded through the streets of Rome as booty of war. And what we can see in this late Renaissance engraving is it's the Arch of Titus. And there again, we can look up and we can see there is the menorah. That was, all of that came from the temple. And this is a painting from the 19th century by Francisco Hayes, and it is called The Destruction of the Temple. And we see people who are on the grand Mizbeach, on the grand altar, and we can see people who are up there, they're fighting the Romans. They are beginning to scream to God that the temple is on fire. And again, down here on the left, you can see the menorah being brought out that would be taken back to Rome. There we can see that. And this is another image of the menorah being brought out by the Roman soldiers. This is a coin that was struck, and it shows Vespasian, who is the emperor. And on the backside, what we see is an image, and it says Judea capta. It means Judea has been conquered. And Judea here is represented by a woman sitting in mourning under a palm tree with a Roman soldier standing behind her. Now, even before this tragedy in Jewish history, Jews had been leaving on their own to go elsewhere and looking for a livelihood. For example, on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see Shrine and Synagogue of Prophet Eliyahu Hanavi. This is where Eliyahu, where Elijah, the prophet, in order to escape the wrath of Queen Jezebel, he went there and he found a cave and he stayed in the cave. And that cave is part of this synagogue. And that happened in the year 720 BCE. Syria's Jewish communities easily date themselves from the period from 720 to about 590. Now, this is someone who is not of that period. This is Jason Guberman Pfeiffer. And while he was in graduate school, he was reading up about Mizrahi Jewish communities, and he found one paragraph in books that dealt with Jewish communities in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. And as a result, he embarked on a campaign to uncover the complexities and the wonders of those Jewish communities that had seemingly been written out of the history of the Middle East. And he founded Dairan. It is a Judeo-Arabic word that means our homes. And he has created a foundation and a research company that has explored so much about the history and culture of the Mizrahi Jews. And we're going to sort of do the same thing. We are going to move into Syria, and we will stop first at Damascus. Then we will go north to Aleppo, one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world. And then we're going to go to an archaeological site that is near Deir al-Zwar. And it will all, I hope, become clear as we make our way around. So these are fragments of a once vibrant Jewish culture. These are the Jews of Damascus. In the parallelogram of four different pictures, the one on the top left is of a family in their home. And it was photographed about the year 1890. Next to that, on the right, is the courtyard of the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue in Aleppo. Down below that, it looks like it could be Purim, because people have on hats and they've got books, but this is actually a wedding, and they're celebrating a wedding, and one of the ways they did it was with paper hats. On the left-hand side is in a synagogue, and it is showing a service that is ongoing, and the image on the right-hand side of the screen shows us boys who are in a cheder, in a religious school. This is one of the older synagogues in Damascus, and it had a phenomenal library, and it also had an area where you could come to pray, tefillah, and then if you did not have the wherewithal to have a meal, it allowed you to get a free meal, because just next door there was a soup kitchen, and we see a picture of that on the right. And the soup kitchen had functioned from 1880, and it functioned until 1945. So it was tefillah and tzedakah. This is another synagogue in the town. It's not as old as the other one. This is the Al-Franji synagogue. We can look and we can see that it looks much more modern. And what we see here is a synagogue in Damascus that was in fact diminishing as the Jewish population diminished. And many of their Torah scrolls actually were very old. Some went back to the 13th and the 12th and the 11th centuries. As the community began to diminish, and as the horrible civil war that has ripped Syria apart grew worse, many of these were supposed to be taken very quietly into Israel or elsewhere. What we see here is a 13th century Torah, and it has disappeared. We have no idea where it is. The communities have no idea where it is. It was meant to go to Ramat Gan, and it never reached there. During the civil war, one of the things that Bashir al-Assad felt is that the Jews were helping his enemies. And so on numerous occasions, areas of the Jewish quarter were firebombed. And here we see they're trying to put fires out. The old synagogue that we saw before, there we see it. We see some of its treasures. The picture on the upper right shows us what it looks like today. It has been utterly destroyed. This is in Aleppo. This is the shrine and the synagogue of the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi since the year 720 BCE. And this is the Aleppo synagogue. You see at the top, it says Cave of Elijah. This is where Elijah reputedly sought shelter and was fed for 40 days by ravens. Around that cave, a large synagogue complex has been built. We have two indoor areas. Now, platforms here are the words used in this drawing for the bima. You can see where the arcs are. There were several of them, but there's also a small courtyard on the left, and there is a larger courtyard in the middle. And there was an outdoor platform because in the hot summer months, very often you would have services moved into this courtyard. And you also had what was called a shofar platform. And that was used, as opposed to being inside, it was used on Rosh Hashanah and the month of Elul, and then also used for the end of Yom Kippur. This is where the shofar was sounded because it would reverberate off of the walls and it would sound mighty as if it were truly coming from heaven. This is what the synagogue looked like, and what it is, it's a model, and this model is in Beit Hatvatzut in Tel Aviv. These are some photographs from the 1920s of the interior. And this is a picture, and it shows the platform for the shofar, and it shows the platform which would have been the bima. That's what we've just seen in the photographs. This synagogue was also noted because of the Aleppo Codex. The Codex was a compilation of all of the Tanakh, and what had been done is, for the first time, the vowels had been put in so that future generations would know how to pronounce the words when they read the Torah. 80% of this codex was snuck out to Israel, and it is in Israel, but 20% of it has disappeared. There is no idea where it is. This was the exterior of the Aleppo synagogue when the last of the Jews left the city almost 10 years ago. And during the Civil War, when the town of Aleppo was being bombarded mercilessly, this is what happened to the rest of the synagogue. This is that outdoor courtyard. The young man on the right is a European Jew who works for Kol Yisrael. It is Israeli radio. And he went to what had been a Jewish Arab market very near the ruins of the Aleppo synagogue. And he spoke with Arabs in the market who had previously worked, in some cases for generations, with the Jews. And they spoke warmly of their Jewish comrades. They lamented the fact that these Jews had left. They would love to have them back, but they fully understood why they had gone. These two individuals are Eli and Rezemam Sadati, and they're from Aleppo. And in the 1930s and 40s, they realized that the stay of the Jews in Syria was going to come to an end. And what they decided to do is they were going to preserve one part of the culture, and that was food. Syrian Jewish cuisine, almost all of the recipes are native to Aleppo, and they had spread throughout all of Syria. And so what we have, again, on the upper left, this is called kibbeh ga'araz. Next to it is tre katafi. Below that is our cheese sambusaks. And then to the left are meatballs with garlic. And then on the other side, the right-hand side of your screen, you have bulgur, onions, and chickpea salad. And of course, you would probably finish your meal with a bit of baklava and mint tea. All of this was put down, and it has become a cookbook. And the cookbook is simply called the Aleppo Cookbook. This is not what Bashar al-Assad has done. This is an archaeological site, and it is out in the desert near a small town. And at one point, it was a huge synagogue complex, and that complex is called Dura Europos. It was created sometime at the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era, and it lasted until the 8th, maybe the early 9th century. And what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is the complexities of this complex, because it was a little bit of everything. This is a drawing of what it looked like. The synagogue is all the way at the back. It is the raised building, and in front of that, there is a courtyard. All of the rest, there was the Beit Din, there were classes to study, there was a school, and it also had in the back, the very, very back in the left-hand corner, that is an abattoir. That was where the shoichet slaughtered animals. So this was an entire complex for the community. Now, this is not that complex. We've now dropped into Israel very, very briefly. This is Beit Aleph. It is an old synagogue, one of the earliest synagogues in the Galilee. And when you go into the area that was the sanctuary, you will find on the floor human figures, human forms. On the left, it is very sort of, we can say it's very simplistic, but this is the Akedah. We can see Avram Avinu, who is about ready to sacrifice his son Yitzchak, but we can see that a hand is coming from heaven telling him to stop. We can see a rather unhappy ram who is somehow attached to a bush. And behind them, we actually see the young men who were left at the bottom of the mountain. And on the right-hand side, we see a mosaic on the floor, and it is of the zodiac. And in the very middle, it looks very much like Apollo, but this is supposedly God. And so these are human forms, and God has been shown in human forms, and yet we know there is a commandment that says you shall have no graven images. I bring this up because in Dura Europos, the entire synagogue is painted with human figures. We're looking at the Western Wall. Now, it's interesting because the Western Wall is what faces Jerusalem, not the Eastern Wall, but the Western Wall. And what we see, now these are all in French, but these are on that Western Wall, these are the people that we would see. Everything from the anointing of Solomon to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, David, King of Israel, crossing the Red Sea, all of these are on that Western Wall. And this is what it looks like. All of these frescoes were meticulously taken down. The roof was recreated, and this was placed in the Archaeological Museum in Damascus. It has been saved. What we have here is the crossing of the Red Sea. Now, look carefully at all of this. We see Moses and Aaron. We see on the far left the army of Pharaoh, and on the far right we see the sea closing over them. We see the hands coming down from heaven of God. Notice we have human depictions, and they are also in very, for them, modern dress, because this is the dress of the Roman Empire. This is Aaron. Notice that his name is spelled out in Greek, not in Hebrew. And this is for the sanctification of the tabernacle. This is the Ark of the Covenant being brought out of a temple of Dagon, which is then smashed and everything is destroyed, and brought back to Jerusalem by King David. This is the anointing of David. Those are his brothers behind him, and that is the figure of Samuel. They look very Roman. This is finding Moses in the Nile River. That is Pharaoh's daughter. Not only do we have female figures, but we have one female figure who is naked. And this is that entire Western Wall in the museum. These are marvels of early Jewish art, and it shows that the Jews who had moved into this area, had they come as captives, had they come as exiles after the destruction of the Second Temple, whatever the fact, it shows that they have integrated themselves into the broader society. And that broader society is one that allows them to do this kind of art and to put it all together in remarkable ways. But the time has come to move from Syria, and we're going to move into Iraq. What we're going to be doing first is visiting Mosul. Mosul is on the site of Nineveh. And then we will go down to Baghdad before we move out of Iraq and into Iran. This is a 19th century vision of what Nineveh may have looked like as the archaeological digs began there. And we know that from the book of Jonah, it is the great city, Nineveh, the great city. And so what we see on the left-hand side of your screen is one of the great gates that led into the great city, and that is the real stuff. That was what those gates looked like. And on the right-hand side, we see these massive creatures that are human, they are eagle, and they are lion. and they would have stood at the bottom of this area. We know about Nineveh, because of the book of Jonah, but we also know about it because it is going to be the Assyrians who destroy the kingdom of Israel. And of course, there's Jonah. And in the background, I don't think that's a dog gadol, a big fish. I think that's actually a whale. But we see Jonah on the beach having been vomited up by that big fish, and he will go to Nineveh to preach. And this is Jonah's tomb. It is where the prophet was supposed to have been buried. It is now part of a complex that encloses as well a mosque. And this is part of the old Jewish quarter in Mosul. Mosul was built much later. Nineveh has gone. It was a huge a huge hill with the ruins of the city under it. But this is the old Jewish quarter. These are the Jews of Mosul in the past. We see a family, and the family on the right is actually a rabbi's family. And on the left, we have a woodworker, because the Jews of Mosul were supposed to have been remarkable carvers of wood. There's that gate again. That is before. ISIS comes in. This is after. That gate, which had been dug out, that gate, which was a marvel of ancient architecture, is now nothing more than rubble. ISIS destroyed it. All of that destruction that you see along the river, that is what remains of the Jewish quarter. All of the Jewish quarter was destroyed. These are some of Mosul's Jewish sites. These are 2 synagogues. The Sassoon family from the city, if you've ever heard of Vidal Sassoon, that is his family. They were bankers, they were entrepreneurs, and they were rabbis. And what we see on the right and on the left is all that remains of their great house and private synagogue in Mosul. And this explosion is the destruction of the tomb of Jonah. This is all that remained of it when ISIS destroyed it. Interestingly enough, when the shrine and the tomb were destroyed, it opened up a chasm beneath it, and they found on the walls these tablets, and the tablets actually told a particular story. This one is how one of the Assyrian kings decided that he needed a period of repentance. Was that because of Jonah? There are still mysteries that we may never be able to solve, but it is interesting that this was found beneath the tomb. This is an individual and a woman behind him. There was a very small Jewish community left in Mosul. In 2013, the last Jews of Mosul quietly left, and they went to Israel. There are no more Jews in Mosul. The Babylonian exile is when Jerusalem eventually fell. Thousands and thousands of Jews were then marched to Babylon, and the Babylonian exile is going to be an era both of nostalgia and remorse but also of incredible creativity. This is a painting by Rembrandt, and it's Jeremiah lamenting Jerusalem. And if you have ever seen this in person, you can actually see that on his face there are tears. Now, what did Jeremiah say? Well, we know he would write the book of Lamentations on the destruction of Jerusalem. But he also said this to the exiles: build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray that the Lord, on its behalf, for its welfare, you will find welfare. Wise words that God spoke to Jeremiah and that Jeremiah told to the exiles. On the left-hand side, we see the tomb of Ezekiel, and on the right, we see scribes. Many of these scribes, and they were there for almost 1,000 years. They would be involved in a remarkable way of preserving the Jewish people and Judaism. And that would be the Babylonian Talmud. The rabbis would discuss, they would have ideas, and then they would pass it on to the scribes to compile. And on the left, we actually see a page of the Talmud. And on the right is a medieval rendering of the same thing. This is with many of the comments by the great Rabbi Rashi. And there it is, the Talmud Bavli. It is massive in its scope, and there would be a second set of volumes written, and it would be written in the land of Israel. And the two at various points do not agree, but they agree to disagree. And the Talmud truly was used by Jews throughout the world, and it held them together. They would discuss things as if they had happened yesterday. Rav Ashi was one of the two principal redactors of the Babylonian Talmud, and his grave we see on the right-hand side of the screen, and on the left-hand side, he is actually teaching a class in a yeshiva. This is not of the period. This is from roughly the mid-16th century. And he sits on his kisei, he sits on his chair, and he takes questions, and he literally has discussions with his students. This is another member of the Sassoon family. This is David Sassoon, and he wasn't into the entrepreneurship. He was not into the banking. He was a rabbi, and he would found a dynasty of rabbis in Baghdad. And from those rabbis also came community leaders. These are Jews in the 1930s. And here we have a Jewish school in 1951. This is the Grand Synagogue, and it was known for its brickwork. All of the bricks were painted blue. So this harkens back to antiquity, and in Babylon itself to the Ishtar Gate. And that is looking at the Ark. We're going to come back to that because we need to talk about the Farhud, the 1st and 2nd of June, 1941. Sami Michal lives in Israel today. He was born in Baghdad, was brought up there. And what is the Farhud? We've all heard of Kristallnacht. The Farhud is analogous in Iraq. He said anti-Semite propaganda was broadcast routinely by the local radio and Radio Berlin in Arabic. Various anti-Jewish slogans were written on the walls on the way to school, such as Hitler was killing the Jewish germs. Shops owned by Muslims had Muslim written on them so they would not be damaged in the case of anti-Jewish riots. Well, this is the beginning of the Farhud. It breaks out, and it is uncertain how many Jews perished, but the number is somewhere between 750 and 1,200 Jews. 900 Jewish homes were ransacked and destroyed, and over 1,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. This shows the crowds who are on their way to that great synagogue, and they're being egged on by individuals on balconies. This is Mordechai Ben Porat, also lives in Israel now, and what he tells us is there were righteous amongst the Gentiles in Iraq. He said, we were mostly cut off from the center of the Jewish community, and our Muslim neighbors became our friends. It was because of one Muslim neighbor, in fact, that we survived the Farhud. We had no weapons to defend ourselves and were utterly helpless. We put furniture up against the doors and windows to prevent the rioters from breaking in. Then Colonel Arif's wife came rushing out of her house with a grenade and a pistol and shouted at the rioters, "If you don't leave, I will explode this grenade right here." Her husband was apparently not home, and she had either been instructed by him to defend us or decide on her own way to help. They dispersed, and that was that. She saved our lives.
Hi.
This is the Wailing Wall that is actually at the tomb of the victims of the Farhud. And they were rapidly buried, and this is someone who has gone to pray at that. Saddam al-Hussein destroyed this. He destroyed so much of what was left of Jewish life that went back to the time of the first temple. This is and it's in Ramat Gan in Israel, where there is a very large Baghdadi Jewish community, and it is called the Mourner, and it's a memorial statue to the victims of the 1941 Farhud.
Rachel's neighborhood, her mother's neighborhood.
This is the former Jewish quarter. No Jews live there now. And these are Jewish homes. And this is the Grand Synagogue today. See that all of that beautiful brickwork has been pulled off. The building stands abandoned. And the last Jews of Baghdad left about 10 months ago. They were very, very old, and they went to Israel. Along with them, someone had taken down one of these lamps that was in the Grand Synagogue and had been protecting it for over 7 decades. And it went with them to Israel. This is the tomb of Ezekiel.
I wonder if it went to the museum.
And there we see Ezekiel's tomb. And what is interesting is as you look around, the covering over the tomb is in Arabic. But as you look around the tomb, you see all sorts of Hebrew inscriptions. Saddam Hussein tried to whitewash all of these Jewish elements. And what has happened since his fall and demise is they have been cleaned off by Muslims themselves. In 1951 to 1953, Iraq's Jews were expelled from the country. They were given literally no time. And what we see here is the Jews of Baghdad and of all of Iraq getting into trucks, being taken to planes, and being flown to Israel. Of course, there were those who stayed behind. And these are two Jewish businessmen who were accused in 1969 of being spies for Israel, Saba Chaim and David Haskiel. After the Second Gulf War, what was found in the basements of one of Saddam Hussein's palaces were an amazing collection of Judaica. Judaica that had originated in Iraq, others which had been brought in. For example, the middle image shows us this is the beginning of the tractate Yoma. And Yoma represents all of the laws concerning Yom Kippur. Some of these have been taken elsewhere, but there is some debate in Iraq as to if all of these things should remain in Iraq, despite the fact that there is no Jewish community there to look after them. This is a group, they were an Iraqi Jewish popular band in the 1930s and 40s, and they were called, and I bring them up because their music was a combination of Arabic, Jewish, and folk musics that were a combination of the two. And what has happened is that this young man, Dudu Tassa, is a rock singer in Israel, and he has resurrected the Kuwaitis as his backup band, and they do music that is both rock and a more very modern take on that traditional music. If you want to know more about the Jews of Baghdad, this is a magnificent, wonderfully written memoir by Jacob Shamash. He came to this country, he was a doctor, and he set up practice in Boston. And this is a remarkable, remarkable book that if you want to know more about these Jews, it's an easy read, and it's available in online or in Barnes and Nobles. I highly recommend it because today there are no Jews in Baghdad, no Jews in Iraq. Well, the Babylonian Empire came to a crashing halt. This is another painting by Rembrandt, and it is of Belshazzar's feast. And during that feast, a mysterious hand begins to write on the wall. And it's in Aramaic, and it's Mene Mene Tekel Ushparin. And it means numbered, weighed, divided. The prophet Daniel came in and explained to Belshazzar that your kingdom is wanting and you are going to fall into the hands of the Persians and the Medes. And in the year 538, that's precisely what happened. The Persians and the Medes entered the city and Babylon fell. So that means we've got to move a little farther east, and we're going to move into what was the Persian Empire. And Susa, we know, is Shushan, that's the book of Esther, and Parasagadye is actually Persepolis, which was the main capital of the empire. And this is a plan of Persepolis and numerous palaces. It looks like almost every king decided he needed another palace, so that's what we get. This is a 19th century image based on archaeological evidence. And these are some of the glories of Persia.
Simon, you're muted.
How's that? Are we back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. This is a golden tablet, and the cuneiform actually tells us that the king is going to permit a group to go back west. It doesn't say Jews, it doesn't say people of Judea, but it's just wonderful to think that that is what this tells. They're also supposedly the tombs of some Jewish prophets. What we see here on the left-hand side of the screen is a place of the prophets, and it's at Kazin, and supposedly Nahum, Haggai, Zechariah, and Obadiah are buried there, despite the fact that two of those also have burial places in Israel. And on the right, it is supposedly the tomb of Habakkuk. And this is also, he has a tomb in Israel. But whatever, these are revered by the Persians. This is the tomb of Daniel. And again, it is in a area that includes a mosque. Cyrus the Great would allow the Jews to return. And in 458 BCE, the Jews return to Zion. They return. This is the grave, the tomb of Artaxerxes II. Now, we know him by a different name, Ahasuerus. This is his tomb. And also, we can find the tombs of Esther and Mordecai, which are revered in Persia. So there we've got that. Hold on just 1 second. My computer seems to want to freeze. The majority of Jews who remain in Iran are in the area of Tehran, and there are some down in Shiraz. These are Iranian Jews across the ages. But the nice thing, more or less, is that there is still a Jewish community in Iran. And here we have some, and this is celebrating Purim. There are roughly 9,000 Jews who remain in Iran, and that is out of a population of almost 300,000. The others have gone either to Israel or to Los Angeles. And women play a role in the Islamic Republic. They vote. They own businesses. This is Siamak Moreh Sedek. He's a member of the Iranian parliament, and he represents the Jewish community. And this is the present chief rabbi of Iran on the left, and his predecessor, the chief rabbi Masallah Golesani Nejad, was elected to that position in 2007. And Rabbi Yusef Hamadi Kohen was the chief rabbi of Iran from 1994 to 2006. This is the Yusufabad Synagogue. It is the largest central synagogue in Tehran. And this is its interior. It is really stunningly beautiful. It can hold up to 1,500 worshipers. And there is actually a very active religious life in Iran. and there are weddings, there are births. It is difficult for Jews to remain there. They know that they are watched, but many of them say, this is where I was born. This is where I hope to die. And also, the Iranian Jewish community love their food. And so what we have here is a lovely accompaniment of various things. Now you're going to hear one word that repeats itself. That's sabzi. Sabzi means green. So that in the upper left-hand quadrant, we have kuku sabzi. This is meat, and it's with all kinds of herbs. Next to that is cello kabub. Beneath that is kuku polo. And then on the far right is morasa polo. And then on the far left, it is gormesh salzi. There is also a very strong tradition of art with the Iranian Jewish community. This one is interesting because it's taken an old photograph and it's reworked it, and this is called Esther's Children, and it's by Dana Nahadrian. There are also a number of artists, such as Maryam Karakachovny and Sara Nazari and Jojo Anvaim. Many of these artists have chosen to go to Israel or to Los Angeles because, as we know, Islam doesn't deal easily with artwork. So we're back where we started. This is the modern state of Israel. Sadly, Syria is now without Jews. Lebanon is without Jews. Iran is without Jews. Iraq is without Jews, and Iran has a Jewish community. 9,000 holding on. But we do know that there are other Jewish communities that would result from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era. And some would go to Egypt and then along the North African coast. Others would go to Italy. And so what we're going to do in the next lecture, we're going to follow these and their traditions. So what I'm going to say is stay tuned for the second chapter of this story. Thank you.
Okay. If anyone would like to ask Simon any questions, you can write it in the chat or unmute yourself.
I have a book recommendation. It's a book very recently published by Mati Friedman. He's an American, been Israeli for a long time. He's an investigative reporter for the Associated Press. And he wrote a book called the Aleppo Codex. It's a great mystery as to what happened. He had some theories about where those missing pages are, and it's not particularly attractive from a Jewish point of view, I have to say. But it's an extraordinarily gripping, wonderful story about the Codex.
Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments?
Yes.
I just want to comment that Dr. Jacob Shamash is an active member of our synagogue, and his medical practice was in Springfield, not in Boston.
Oh, he says Boston.
He's a member of our synagogue.
Simon, Susan Goldman, I'm hoping that you are aware of and have been to the Iraqi Museum outside of Tel Aviv.
I have not.
So it is an absolutely exquisite museum, founded in part by the family of a member of our community, Rachel Sampson, who is Kaduri.
Oh, right.
Her family came, must know Rachel through the programs. Rachel's father was an artist, in addition to having his company of his sign painting, but he was an artist, and it is an absolutely exquisite museum you must go to. I don't remember the town. It's 20 minutes out of, not far from Ramadan. And there is a small Iraqi community there now. And you can go around the corner to have Iraqi food, but the museum is beautiful. Arts and simulations of homes and synagogues. Really, you should talk to Rachel about it. A lot of her father's artwork is there.
Great. Thank you so much. Any other questions, comments? Does everyone want to go have a piece of halava now? Baklava, mint tea.
And
Thank
your
you very
Persian
much.
pronunciations were very accurate.
Reverend
Thank you.
Aminya, Reverend Aminya, why don't you, Reverend Aminya, tell everybody where you're from.
I was born in Iran, but I've been in this country for over half a century. So
Alrighty. Well, if there are
but
no other,
I still speak Farsi.
all right, everyone. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll
Simon.
be with us in a couple of months.
Thank you so much again,
Thank you.
Simon, for giving us an extraordinary experience with you. Looking
Pleasure
forward to
indeed.
seeing you in December.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care. Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.